Hey, I'm James Egbert, and today I'm going to be showing you a couple of different tools that I use a lot in order to it's been a big piece of how I've gotten my own kind of customized sound, and hopefully this will give you some ideas on how you could customize and personalize your own sound. So the couple of things that I'm really going to be talking about today are reverb and its uses, more from an artistic standpoint rather than a utilitarian sort of standpoint, and actually creating space. We're going to use it in a different sort of way than it's naturally meant to be used, and create some really pretty wild stuff. And then another thing that I'm going to talk about is oscillator phase lock on synthesizers, and how you can use that to powerfully change and manipulate whether it be bass sort of sound design or chord sound design. Just how I feel like that's really the root of the synthesizer, is understanding oscillator lock in terms of phase. So I'm going to jump right in here. I've got a number of sounds that I've already set up, and one of these is arpeggiator, very similar to some of the sort of style that I've used. I'm going to be using Serum a lot today, and so we'll jump right in. I feel like Serum is a very flexible synthesizer, but just the natural sound of it, the oscillators sound very warm, the filter sounds very warm. I like it, but I'm not going to get too advanced in it, just to show you that this is capable of carrying over into any other VST that you might have. So you could do the same sort of practices in massive, silent, and I can open one of those up in a little bit and show you kind of where those buttons would be located. So what I've got here is a very simple patch. These are 2 saw waves, and they're running through a filter. And what I'm doing here is I'm understanding kind of my end result. So with that, I've turned this resonance up, and we'll listen to this really quick. So what I'm doing is I'm using this knob right here to sweep up this filter cutoff, and that's with this resonance bumped. That's what's giving us that effect. We're also running it through Valhalla Vintage Verb. So I'm going to turn this off, and you can hear how it naturally sounds just on its own with these 2 sawtooth oscillators, and you'll hear that it's very different. So the reason that I'm running it through this reverb, this is something that I discovered about 4 or 5 years ago, and it kind of became my signature sound for a very long time, is that whenever you run it through a reverb, the reverb kind of gets this sort of, gives it this sort of vocal, kind of human-like characteristic to it. So what I'm going to do here, very quickly, I'll dive through a couple of the key characteristics of this patch. It's 2 saw waves, cutoff is up, the resonance is up. But the other thing that's kind of giving this sound a lot of character is this legato voicing glide. And so what legato means is that whenever notes are overlapping, then it will trigger a glide. Whereas if this wasn't on, let's just pull these notes back a little bit. I'll turn this reverb off. So right now I have legato glide off, which means that every time that a note hits, it's going to glide. But if I turn legato on, which has some really awesome purposes, then only the notes that are overlapping are going to. So to just showcase this, I'm going to pull these out so that these 2 are not going to overlap. They'll go directly to that note, and these ones will glide. If I mess with the portamento time, that's the glide time, that kind of helps to accentuate what it's doing there. So I'm going to hit undo here and get those notes all spread out. And I'll show you really why here in a moment. So I'm going to turn my reverb on. This is at 100% here, and it's got a nice long decay on it. And that's what's really kind of washing it out. So I'm going to click the A button. This will open up Logic's automation. And one thing that's kind of helpful sometimes, you can dive through all of these, but Serum especially has a very vast list of things that you can automate. So here's kind of a little side tip, I suppose, that can really help you out if you do want to save yourself some time and you don't want to go all the way through that. You can turn this from read mode into touch mode. So what that means is that anything that you touch while it's playing is going to record that automation. So we can just do that to find this filter cutoff knob. So I'm going to hit play, wiggle it a little bit, and now you see here we've got this nice automation lane set up. So I'm going to switch back to read mode so that it only reads. It doesn't have any writing capabilities to it. And I'm going to delete this stuff. What I like to do in terms of setting this sort of instrument up, I'll start out kind of low and give it a listen. Sounds good. I might go a little lower. And then I'm just going to gradually, over the course of 16 bars, sweep it towards the top end. And you'll see again where this really kind of comes into play, because we're going to pull out the really highly vocal characteristics of this synth. So I'll skip in here, kind of listen to it. Skip in here. And I likely won't end up using this in the final outcome of this sort of lead that we're making here. But it will be useful nonetheless to have that kind of higher end information. So I'm going to close this right now. And what I'm going to do now is just kind of a sort of technique to help really flatten that reverb onto the sound, kind of make the reverb even more dense. And so I'm going to just apply a very thick compressor to it. So as I'm looking at this, my goal here, because it's such a sort of long and smooth like the content there, I'm going to pull out the release time here on the compressor. I'm going to turn the ratio up so that makes, let's switch over into graph mode too, and hopefully this will be a little bit more graphic. So what the release mode is going to do is just going to bend this knee area right here. So let's take that up a bit. And what that means is that for any audio content that's above this threshold that we set here, it's going to flatten that audio out in terms of volume. So, and you can see here now that we're in graphical mode, because we're bringing that volume down though, we need to make up that gain. We need to turn it up to be audible again. I'm going to pull that up a little bit. And that's fine. We're kind of at the same listening level that we were earlier. And because we're being technical here today, sometimes whenever I'm in very music sort of writing mode, I'm not necessarily looking at levels. But since we're being technical today, I'm going to actually make sure that we're under here. Basically, to kind of further explain that, whenever I'm writing very aggressive sort of dance music, a little bit of, I'm actually using a lot of distortion throughout that whole process. So I'm not necessarily too overly concerned as I'm going through the songwriting process. A lot of times with where my levels are, just because we're dealing in a digital realm and rather than an analog realm where headroom is actually a much it's a much more ambiguous sort of thing dealing in the digital realm. Whereas in the analog days, things had a physical limit much more than they do here. But I'm gonna get back at this and we'll pull this down to make sure that the level there is appropriate. So even here, I can pull the input gain down if that's a very important thing. Like I said, to me, it's not, because so much of the music is going to be distorted anyways. I don't feel like I'm hearing anything, so I'm using my ears before my eyes on a lot of this stuff. I'm going to loop this central chunk because that's kind of where the filter resonance is really coming out the most. So I'm still compressing this pretty harshly. And so you hear now that the compressor's on it, it's going to end up accentuating that reverb a little bit more. So I've got this whole chunk here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, or if you don't have your mouse set up that way and you're in Logic, I believe it's command click, or no, control click, sorry. I've set my magic mouse up to enable a right finger click, which is helpful, honestly. So I'm going to click bounce in place here with this. And what this is going to do is now take this MIDI signal that's talking directly to Serum, and that's going to create it as a audio file. And this is where stuff is going to get really interesting. You're going to have capability to do stuff that you can guarantee that nobody else will have access to, because you're making this sound completely unique to yourself and to the experience and environment that you're currently in. So I can guarantee now that nobody else in the world is ever going to have these same settings, and we're going to take this one step further. So we'll title this Reverb Lead. Hit OK. And there was one important thing that I missed on there, and I can double back to it. But I had the normalize feature off. What normalize means that the loudest part of that audio file is now going to be at 0 decibels. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this channel. I don't need that. I need a normalized, nice, healthy chunk of audio. So we'll click bounce in place, and where that comes into effect is right here. You can turn that on, and what you'll see this difference now. Reverb lead. So now, because this was normalized, this high point right here, where the audio peaked out a little bit, that's going to be at 0. So that's essentially what that means. That being said, this is going to be really loud now, so I'm going to turn that down quite a bit. And just to the relative volume where everything else is. So now we've got this. I don't need this anymore. And because we use that compressor, what that means is that all of this audio content here is going to be much more kind of thick, because you're not going to have as drastic variance between the high and low point anymore. The goal with that was just to kind of flatten this out. And now I'm going to tell you kind of why that is. What we're going to do is we're going to listen through here for some interesting points. And this is, of course, up to interpretation. But I'm going to listen through here and find some really kind of some interesting things, and I'm going to chop those out uniquely. So if I hit the T button here, I can open up this secondary menu, and this is like a huge quick tool just to help with help speed stuff up, really. So I'm going to go to this scissors tool, and that will allow me to just click here and separate things. So as I'm listening, you can do it one of two ways. You can do it that way. Another way that I often like to do is switch back to the pointer tool, and Command T is the quick key in order to separate. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to listen through this, and as I hear something that I feel like is interesting, I'm going to just punch Command T. What I was listening for right there was I was listening to the cutoff filter as the resonance on it was cranked. We're getting all these different frequencies that are starting to spike. And so I'm listening for those frequencies that I have a feeling like where that cutoff filter is going to make something interesting happen. So going back to this, I'm just going to go to these sections where I made those cuts, and I'm going to pull this region marker back just a little bit, and I'll go in, delete some of this other content here. So none of that was all that exciting, but I liked this. It's kind of interesting. So then I'm going to go in here, see what this one was all about. Kind of right there sounds nice. And what we're going to do is pick out individual notes that I think are pretty cool. That sounds really interesting once it's suddenly just a brief moment. And that's not very natural with a dense reverb, because you're used to hearing it where it's just going to splash out like crazy. So in effect, by putting reverb on the audio and then chopping it, you're creating something completely different, and you're getting overtones from previous notes that are kind of bleeding over into the extra content there. I really like this area right here. I'm gonna just kind of further pinpoint that. Really interesting. Cut this back to this beginning chunk. And yeah, I'm just trying to bring out the sort of human-like qualities out of a synth, which is obviously not human. Pretty cool sort of way to get some unique stuff. Go back here, and then I don't think I'm going to need any of this. So, one thing that's kind of cool to do as well is I like to just keep this extra content every now and then. So let's see where we're at now. Now it's a process of further refining the sounds that I've got, and seeing what I really like, what I don't like. And this is all just a personalization, a customization that I feel like really allows you to be very unique by kind of carrying on this method. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can apply this to something not so specific as just a sawtooth-based synthesizer. But for now, let's deal with this. This is where we're at with these sounds. I'm going to pull these in a little bit just so I can listen to stuff with a little better ease. Pull these over, and that'll be good. So now it's a matter of kind of repurposing these into a new melody. So I'm going to go to this one and see what my favorite note on this is. I like that. I don't know what the note is, but second, right here. Boop. So this is the other fun part about chopping audio, is that you're never going to, after this reverb is on here, you're never going to get just a pure note. That's another really important thing about this whole process, is that you're getting extra character onto these notes, and they're now committed to audio. And it's just another way of further emphasizing your own unique nature of this melody. So let's start off. I'm at 128 BPM. Let's just do something that's got these two triggering back to back. And I'm going to go over here, select both of these, go over here to fade out, fade in. Just take them, and that'll get rid of those clicks. All right, so I've got that. Now let's go and listen through here to see what other interesting notes we might find. I like this bit in here. So let's chop that down. Let's listen to this. Pretty cool. We'll pull this one back here. And now we've got something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go to this one, fade out, fade in. The reason that I'm not doing this on all of these is that after I'm cutting things even further into place, I'm going to have to do it again. So let's go through here, listen to this guy. That's pretty cool. Like, it sounds kind of like a girl singing, I feel like, on that first note. Let's pull that back. Another interesting one. So we can pull this back and like that end there. I think I might have cut it a little too soon. Yeah. It sounds almost like a cat. And let's listen to this one. I like the second note. And the cool thing about this too is that, like, there's really no way to mess it up because you're creating something just completely unique. Whatever you want it to be. I'm just going to quickly chop these. Take that one, chop, delete that content, and I'll make two chops on this one. So I'm going to Command T, that's my one quick key to cut, and I believe right here. Take this little section here where that switches notes. And we'll drag this out a little bit. The one thing with this approach, though, is that it does take some time to really dial it in if you are looking to go super far in depth, but I'm not going to go that far today. And I think that we can still tell what it's going to sound like, or how it could sound if you were to choose different notes or choose different content. So I like this as well. Just this little bit. So I'm going to shorten my loop length here up on the top, and we'll go to 2 bars. And we'll kind of mess with this for a moment and see if we can figure out something cool. So I'm going to select all of this stuff now. These are all final, and I'll double click this fade in, 1, double click this fade out, 1. And that should apply a fade in. No, it didn't. It decided not to. So I guess just the stuff that I haven't already done there. and then these other 3 chunks I already. So if I just syncopate this onto the grid that I'm working with, then it'll start to kind of have its own little life. So what I'm going to do, I'll just make this up right now in my mind. So I did these first 2 triggers back to back on 8th notes, so I'll do that with this guy as well. Then go, I believe this is a dotted rhythm. And back to there, so that this will kind of re-trigger. So let's listen to this. I obviously haven't listened to this at all. It just kind of made it, but I have a feeling it'll sound pretty cool either way. So it gets a little interesting here where we're, as I was saying earlier, if you're getting content from previous notes, that's kind of what makes it special, but that's also what can make it sound a little bit weird. So I'm going to go back into these last 2 cuts and just kind of make sure that we're on the same page. And what I'll do here is I'll just set up a really short loop. And I think what I need is just a little bit earlier. I'm going to delete this one and just take this guy. And now we're kind of in line with the groove of the track. So one thing that we can do to kind of make this even further exciting, which I've done a lot, is I'm going to hit this plus button right here to duplicate this track. So we'll do that once and do that twice. And what I'm going to do is we'll set this one up R, reverb. Actually, we'll just type verb, lead, and we'll make this one L for left. Keep this one verb, lead, mid. And then let's make this one verb, lead, R for right. And I'm going to take the panning on this. So now if we listen to this, it should all be on the left. Now it's in the middle. If I move it to this track, it'll be on the right. So let's spread these out across 3 different channels that are just with different panning. So let's go left, right. And then we can even cut some of these further in the middle so that it goes back maybe right to left. Except with this, I've got to make sure that I've got my fades on them. Make sure that they're not popping. And we'll do the same thing here, just split those out and go at this one here, left, and then it'll end in the center. So fade out. Oops. All right, so let's listen to this. One of the other things that I like to do is kind of mix all this stuff up too. So if I were to truly implement this into a track, I wouldn't want the whole progression of it to follow that cutoff sweep that I initially did, where it went from cutoff low to cutoff high. So I would probably go back in here and edit a few of these notes around so that you'd have some kind of higher harmonic content earlier, or vice versa. Let's just do that really quickly and can show you. So let's take this one here in the middle. Let's take this guy right here. We'll go right, left, and then we'll replace him over here. Another cool thing that you can do now that it's in audio is you can create sort of stutter effects very easily. I'm going to shift this to the center. Actually, we'll push this here. I'm just kind of feeling like fiddling. So let's listen to how that changes really quick. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut this to the 16th note, and I'm going to duplicate it onto a 16th note. If I come up here into my sort of transport section of Logic, I can click this button right here. This is the 16th note. That's showing the grid settings. Switch it to 32nd really quick, and let's chop these down a little bit. So if I make them a little bit smaller than this 32nd note, what I'm then going to do is drag them over into that gap. And if I click the Alt Option button, that'll duplicate them. So let's check that out. So I'll go back to 16th note here, and let's do some of those sort of stutter effects with some of these other ones. A great and easy way to do that is to take the audio region, move it in front of itself, copy it in front of itself, and then chop it slightly. So let's do that with this guy right here. Move it in front of itself. I'm going to make it just smaller. We can put this one back here too. So we'll push this, move it in front of itself, smaller, and then I'll put this down here. And kind of just spread some of those around a little bit. So that's one way that you can very easily get to your own sort of customized sound. That's how I did it a number of years ago, is just using reverb in a way that reverb wasn't necessarily meant to, in order to slur notes in between each other. Then you get these beautiful sort of melodies that doesn't really require anything too elaborate. So I mean, if we listen to this really quick. Go back to the original, unmute this. Probably would have never guessed that the two things came from the same thing. But all that is that's two sawtooth waves and a cutoff with a high resonance. And it's really that simple to get to your own unique sound just by using some effects that were not meant to be used in the way that you're going to use them. We just talked about how reverb could be very influential to a synthesizer whenever you're using it as a way kind of opposite to what it's supposed to actually naturally do. Now we're going to do that with one of the most practical purposes out there, I think, in dance music today, and that is with creating our own sort of Prida snare. I think that this is also another really cool way to further your own sound and kind of further your own unique sound is by creating stuff like your own Prida snare. Like if dance music community is using something largely, or if any music community is using something largely, like if you can make it your own, that's always the best way to do it. So let's jump into this. What I've got is I've got a snare from Future Music magazine. This is one of their free samples. I'm sure that you could find a free sample very similar to this out on the internet somewhere. Let's hit play here and see what the sound's like. It's got a lot of content in 1,000, sort of 1,500 frequency range. And that's kind of what's making this snare, I think, special or big sounding. So it's a good snare sample, and we're going to take it one step further by applying a reverb to it And then even after that, we're going to cut that reverb so that it's only in the sort of space that we want it to be in during the song. I can close that. Now I'm going to turn on Space Designer. And Logic X right now is kind of having some issues. I think Logic X always has had some issues. But one of the big issues is right now, it's not really that big of an issue, but the visualizer in the latest update that they came out with for Logic X is no longer working in Space Designer. So that's going to be a little unfortunate, but we could use any reverb to do this, and you'll kind of hear how that's possible in just a moment. Turn this on, it's just a factory default setting for the snare. We'll bring this. This is the reverb, this is a dry signal, so we can make that even the max. So right now we've just got this basic factory default reverb on here. We're on the snare drum, and if I turn this on, we've got reverb volume, dry volume. And again, this is a sort of thing where really the reverb and kind of the way that you want it is everything to the sound. So I'm going to click through this synthesized IR button. If I do that again, it'll just slightly change the reverb. You can hear it's slightly different. And what I'm listening to is how this is actually changing the content of the reverb frequency-wise. So for that Prida snare sound, I'm going to go for something pretty, it's got a pretty warm feeling to it. So I'll just click through a few more of these and I'll land on one. That one sounds good. So this is just randomizing it every time that you click it. It's kind of just slightly switching through just a different sort of algorithm here in Space Designer. And as I was saying, right now the content isn't showing up here just because of the latest Logic update, which is kind of sad, but we'll get over it. So one thing I just discovered is kind of how to fix this. The waveform is now here. Basically, whenever you open a fresh instance, we'll just do it right here to prove this. Space Designer, whenever you open it, not there. If you minimize it, but then open it again, it's there. Voila. Go Logic. Back to this though. You want to make sure that that your reverb volume is in a good comparison with your dry volume. I think psychologically, as a human, we always like to hear stuff loud. And so you can really trick yourself into doing a bad mix down if you're going in at a loud level. One thing that I always like to do to just double check myself on that is that I like to pull the volume of whatever new thing I'm introducing. So that, again, this goes for mix down or this goes for just even introducing an effect. I like to bring it up from the lower end of things, and then when it sounds loud enough, that's the right point. Rather than having it loud kind of where you're listening to what the effect is doing, but then you leave it that loud. Once you get into the finality of your mix and stuff like that, you're going to run into some real issues because stuff is just going to sound way too out of balance, I think. At least that's what I've experienced in the past. So I've pulled this reverb all the way down. I'm going to hit play here, listen through the dry content, and bring up this reverb in relationship to it so that I'm really making sure that it's sitting well together. So dry. So we're at least 4 decibels lower than where we would have been had I just kind of went with what I was initially interested in. So I think that's going to be the best fit right there. Close this, and now we can bounce this into place. So snare, we'll call this the Egbert snare, because it's not the Prida snare, but still pretty good. So now that we've got this bounced to audio, again, as I was showing earlier, I had it normalized. So that means that this audio content is nice and big, but nice and loud. So I'm going to pull this volume down before I start playing around with it again so I don't blow my ears out. So typically with that sort of Prida snare thing, the way that it's executed upon is that it usually comes at the last 4 bars, but it then cuts out so that that next hit in the beat is has its full force as well. It doesn't have any more of that reverb on it. So I'm going to hit Command T here on this quarter note so that it just makes this a quarter note. Command T. And now let's make our loop right here. And we'll listen to this. So there you kind of have a pretty interesting sort of Prida snare sound. The way that we can kind of go further with this is by throwing a compressor on it. So I'm going to go into Dynamics here on Logic, Compressor, and let's mess around with some of these settings. Again, we're going to be listening a lot to how this is affecting the sound, what it's doing to it. Really the focus in this sort of music is listening with your ears, not necessarily so much your eyes. So I'm going to go through here and just listen to this and see how it affects it. Now also using our eyes, we can see that it's flattening that, but in using my ears, I'm hearing that there's a really fine smack on the front of it. I want to get rid of that a little bit. So I'm going to bring this compressor down to 0 so that it just hits right away, and hopefully that'll get rid of the click. And I'll just play with this really quickly so that you can hear what it's doing. So you can hear that we're really affecting the front end of that dynamic in terms of how it's coming into the compressor. So I am going to have that just at 0, and I'm going to squash the entire thing so that it's all just one big beefy chunk. And I'll turn the release time up a little bit so that it's just there the whole time. And again, now we have to bring our makeup gain. So there, we've got a pretty big sort of reverb snare hit that's going to stop immediately whenever it gets to that next quarter note, all because we printed the reverb onto the snare in terms of audio, and now we can cut it much easier. So now I'm going to talk about how we can use reverb on another sound to, again, just be additive in the sound design process rather than just in a straight up utilitarian sort of fashion with reverb in terms of putting something in a space or whatever. We're actually going to use it to apply texture to the sound, and then we're going to go into some sound design with it. So I've got Serum open, and I'm actually going to reverse engineer this sound and then show you kind of how simple it is by redoing it in Logic as well. So let's listen to the sound. It's kind of like I like to think of it like a Mario jump or something like that. It's like one of those, we're going to make it a little 8-bit it's the direction that we're going to go with it, but it's got that sort of I have it labeled blip here because that's what it sounds like in my mind. Is it just sounds like a video game sort of style thing. So what we've got here is it's just Serum's basic analog, basic MIDI, using their square waveform, and very simple patch. All I've got going on is just a short envelope, so this kind of helps it have a little bit more attack. Then additionally, I've got envelope 2 going to the filter cutoff, and what that's doing, you can see here, is okay. So then we've got envelope 2 going to Serum's cutoff, and that's just a very short decay, and that's giving it some pop as well. But the real thing that we're doing here is with envelope 2, I'm using that to effect in the matrix. That's the master tune. So it's coming from underneath the note, and then it's rising into the note at 53 milliseconds. So that's basically how I'm making this. And to just really show you how simple this is, I'm going to close Serum right now. Keep that in mind, and I'm going to open up Logic's ES1. This is how I've made this sound for years. So I've got my cutoff fully open. This is, I think, a user default that I've set up. And it's just great for me to quickly get to some of the things that I want to get to, rather than sometimes Logic or whatever DAW you're in will have kind of some weird sort of preset that's not really all that user-friendly. I like to have stuff pretty well initialized, and so this is basically that for me. It's just very simple and easy for me to get into a lot of different things. So I've got the cutoff wide open. I'm going to switch this over to the square. First of all, listen to this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this cutoff over to pitch, and I'll have it set to decay. Actually, no, sorry. I'll set this to attack because I don't have the flexibility that I do in Serum in order to decide which way, whether above the note or below the note. In this instance, it only takes pitch up. So we're going to have to listen to this a little bit. And basically this attack mode kind of decides that it will go underneath the note, whereas so it's going from underneath. Decay will go from above the note. So we'll switch it over to attack to get that sort of blip sound. And I think we're at 58 or so milliseconds. Let's try that again on here and see. Sounds pretty good. Next thing I'm going to do is bring this cutoff down a little bit. I don't have that flexibility that I had in Serum to assign another one of these to the cutoff, but what I will actually do is kind of trick it. Rather than envelope, having envelope-based modulation, I'm going to just have a LFO-based modulation. So it's going to be doing the same sort of thing. So I'm going to set it here to this sawtooth based LFO, and seeing that I've got it here every half note in Logic, I'm going to bring this sync ratio to half note. And actually, I can do a quarter note. I could do a number of speeds that are slower than a half note. The main thing is that I want it to be longer than this 16th note so that it doesn't re-trigger. So let's go into 8th note and let's listen to that. I'm going to switch this from pitch to cutoff. And what that's doing, as you can hear, is that spiking the cutoff every 8th note. We only have the 16th note of MIDI, so we're all clean and clear there. So pull that up again. And if you want to go higher, that'll give it more of that pluck. And then same thing that we had going on in Serum right here, I'm going to pull down this actual amplitude envelope and bring it to just a nice short plucky sort of thing. So there we are back at our blip. So the next thing I'm going to do is throw some reverb on it. I'm going to go in, we'll pull up Space Designer, and so that we get this beautiful display, I'm going to close that and then reopen it. It's a bug in Logic 10.2. So now we've got this again, and we're going to want to go for something a little bit shorter this time. And I'm going to go medium because I'm still going to chop it after the fact. So we don't want it too short, but we want it still pretty short. So let's go Bright Hall and see what that sounds like. Already you can kind of hear how that's put into a completely different space. And if we bring this reverb up a little bit more, sound even cooler. So let's go through a couple of different sounds just to make sure we can remember Bright Hall. It's easy enough to remember. I'm going to go for something a little bit longer, maybe this space reverb. Let's see how that sounds. Medium. So you can tell with that reverb, it's got a really long attack time, almost delayed. And I don't really want that. I'm not necessarily into that. Let's try to find something else. That was pretty cool. Let's stay there. Midnight Hall. So that is in Space Designer on medium spaces, halls, and Midnight Hall. So I'm going to take that and then we'll leave it there. And what I'm going to do is, again, a technique that you're not supposed to do. You always hear people talking about kind of the proper form of things. So it's always like, well, you want to compress before you put reverb on it. You want to put distortion on it before you put reverb on it. But we're thinking outside the box here, and we're using reverb as a sound design tool rather than a literal sort of engineering based tool. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to slap a bit crusher on top of this after the reverb. And I'll show you in a moment just how big of a difference that makes. So, and what I'll do is I'll just switch these to, switch the process of this so that the bit crusher comes before the reverb, and you'll hear immediately what's going on. So for this sort of thing, we're going to make it 8-bit. That's actually not the most character-defining element of this. What we're going to go for is the downsampling, and let's just listen to that. So. So one of the things that I'm kind of instantly picking up on as I'm affecting this is that we're not quite getting to that note. There's not enough tonality in it for my personal taste. I want to get to that. So I'm going to pull this back a little bit so that it gets there quicker. And then I'm going to listen for the downsampling multiplier that actually ends us in harmonic with this F that we're on. So I believe 13 was all right. But it's a little bit more pure than I want it. So I'm going to go down quite a bit further. We'll go. So that's kind of bringing out the 5th of that note. And so I'm going to stop that there. So what I'm going to do is put this bit crusher on before the Space Designer, and now you can really hear what's going on. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to delete this second one here, and then I'll bring this back. I'm going to bounce this down, bounce in place. So Mario jump 1, bounce that to a new track. And then I'm going to switch those, and I'll get the other one, and then we can really listen to them side by side a little bit better even. So unmute this, go here, switch through this process, and bounce this in place. Mario jump 2. Now we'll have both of these, and again, we're normalizing, so we're going to have to pull the volume down before we listen to it, or we'll blow our faces off. And I'm going to put this right side by side here on. Pull that down, delete that there, and I'm going to pull this to the same essential level that this is at. So let's listen to both of these and see what the difference is. So the first thing is volume. So I'm going to pull the gain on this guy down a little bit just to hopefully hypothetically match. But the big reason that we're experiencing that drastic volume difference is that I'm now distorting the rest of this reverb tail, whereas I wasn't on that first one. So the way that I kind of have been envisioning this whole time is the same thing that we were doing with that Prida style snare, is just having it in for about an 1/8 note. So I'm going to cut this down to size, and now we can really listen. So I'm going to get both of these, and then I'm going to hit Alt and drag them over so that we can listen to them. Actually sounds a little bit more like a delay. So by having that distortion on the reverb itself, you're getting a very different and I think a little bit more aggressive sound than if you have that sort of feature the other way around. So that's just what I would really encourage you guys, is to experiment with the flow of things and kind of the process of things. Don't feel so stuck to, if you learn about doing things a certain way, don't feel stuck to having them in that specific order, because you might get a really interesting effect by switching that up and completely rearranging the order of process there. So that's kind of one thing that I've done a lot in my career in order to get my own sort of distinct sound. It's been a lot of distortions after reverbs, compressors after reverbs, and just kind of opening my mind to the other possibilities. And that's how I get some sort of features that can really pop out of the mix. The best thing that I've found is whenever you can have something that's very abrasive amidst something that is very clean, and that really just helps things pop so much more. So if you use this sort of technique in terms of distorting a reverb amongst something that's clean, or more so clean sounding, that's when you'll really have stuff pop out of your mix, and that's when you can really create some very unique and very interesting emotions within the context of your music. So now we're going to talk about another aspect of sound design that I think has been like really crucial in terms of me understanding the fullness of sound design. It's a very overlooked feature on many synthesizers, but it's pretty crucial in terms of understanding the potential and the direction that you want to go in sound design. So that feature is the phase lock on oscillators and between oscillators. So what I've got here, I've got a instance of Serum that I've already set up. And I've got 2 of these channels set up. I'll just show you both of them quickly so that you can hear and you can immediately tell the difference of what's going on. But just to quickly explain this, I've got both cutoffs open. These are both the same 2 waveforms. It's saw wave, 2 of them. And then I've got mono on and legato on. And I've got these 2 notes dropping from an octave up on F down to a lower octave F. So you'll hear this glide sort of engaging at this speed here, 449 milliseconds. So what I'm going to do is solo this now, pull this up, and let's play this guy. Go back to the first, second, you can already tell there's a pretty vast difference, but in terms of looking at these 2 synths, they're almost identical. The one thing that's very different about them is that the phase randomization on Serum is turned completely down on this second bass here, and it's completely wide open. So what that means, you can see here, B, random phase, determines how random the start position in the waveform is on a new note. So, and yeah, actually that's a good point that they've got here. Most noticeable when both oscillators are audible. So we can just turn this one off really quick and listen. Can't quite tell, but whenever both are open, you actually get a phasing sort of effect. So that's kind of the first thing, and based on just that one switch, I've got both of them detuned slightly. You're getting a very different sound. The sound is drastically different based on the synthesizer, allowing the oscillators to freely determine their own phase point whenever they start, or that phase being re-triggered from the exact same point every time that note is hit. So if we go to this one with the phase that's locked, that's this guy over here, and I hit this, sounds the exact same every single time that you hit it, whereas on this guy, not necessarily as audible because it's free-flowing. So that's kind of really it to describe that one small feature. However, I'm going to go into depth on how far you can take this thing. So for re-style basses, which are kind of more used in drum and bass and kind of some aspects of dubstep and things, I'm going to use this, start out with this bass that does not have any of that oscillator lock on it. So it's a completely random phase whenever it starts, and so you can hear pretty familiar sound. And again, going back to what I was talking about before, with sound design, it's not often as complex as you think it is. These are just 2 saw waves that are slightly detuned from each other, and it already sounds pretty massive. I'm going to hit play on this little loop, and I'm going to go into some other sort of sound design features of where I would take this into kind of a Reese style bass line. The next thing I'm going to do to this is apply some of Logic's Bit Crusher, and I absolutely love Logic's Bit Crusher, but not even necessarily for its bit crushing. What I like it mostly for is its fold back distortion mode. And what that is, you can see here pretty drastically what it's doing based on actually Logic just updated this, so it's a little bit more visual than it used to be. So if we're in clip mode here, I'm going to pull this down. We can listen. really just driving the sound up into its ceiling here, you know. So whenever I switch this over to fold back, you start to get this kind of more gritty texture, which I really love about this. It kind of sounds like you're making the waveform more spiky, you know, in this sort of sense. It sounds like it's giving it a little bit more more grit on the top and more texture on the top rather than this clip mode. And this is really kind of brought out a lot further whenever you take it to more of an extreme. So I'm going to pull it up a little bit more. Yeah, you can already hear that's a little bit more of a smooth option. Whereas that, you're dealing with a little bit more high-end frequencies and stuff. So it's kind of important to really listen to what frequencies you are distorting in this sort of moment, because that's going to really play a huge part in the overall sound design and the overall objectives of what you're going to try to do. So one of the big things that I often do before a bit crusher, even if I put one on like I just did, I like to pull up, and I'll pull up Logic stock channel EQ just for the sake of hopefully more people kind of having this option. So let's look at this and see how the sound changes as you add or subtract frequencies which you are allowing to enter into the bit crusher. So first thing I'm going to do, which is going to be one of the most drastic impacts that you can have on the distortion process, is pulling out some of the low end. So it seems to me like the majority of like the beef of this sound is kind of hanging out in this 200 hertz area. Let's turn on, why is this analyzer not? There we go. So if you hear, as we have it here, you're getting a lot of kind of lower mid, and it takes away from what you're able to achieve on this upper end. So. Let's take this to a 48. One thing that we could do to take this even further would be to automate this bell right here. So let's do that really quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the bass channel here, click the A button, and that pulls up the automation lane. And what I'm going to do is another little kind of trick that I did earlier. I'm going to switch this over to touch, so that whenever I hit play and I touch this, it's going to keep that there. But before I do that, actually, I'm going to switch to region mode before I start to play. And basically what this means is that now, as I'm drawing the automation in on this bass region, it's going to stick to the region. Whenever I loop it out, it's going to hold that automation. So let's do that really quick. So I'm going to hit touch and just be ready to go, because I can give myself a little bit of an advanced warning. So I'm going to listen here, and we'll turn on the metronome. We'll go. So got that kind of interesting little thing that I just did. I'm going to turn that back to read mode, so that's right back here, and now whenever I touch things, it's not going to affect that. So again, if I loop that out, you can see that that's now being affected there. So now we're kind of getting more of a vowel-like resonance in there. So. And let me show you really quickly the difference between having your bit crusher before and after this channel EQ. I'm going to push this after. Well, first of all, Logic's automation won't hang. So even just turning off this channel EQ, huge difference. But all because we EQ'd it, we sucked the bass out a little bit beforehand. That's making this more tonal. So I'm just going to edit this really quickly, turn down the gain of how high this comes up, and that'll kind of help us, I think. Turn down this frequency as well. And I'm just double clicking this to get rid of some of these points. And all right, so I'm gonna just save this session really quickly, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you that importance of the oscillator lock. So rather than trying to switch stuff over to this channel, I'm just gonna copy this and drag this down, so we should hear the same thing. Now let's go back into Serum and let's take this phase randomization all the way down. And let's see how much that changes. Pretty different, huh? So that will kind of further dictate which direction I continue to go. One of the kind of the old school method of getting through a lot of this bass sort of sound design, because it was so processor heavy back in that day for the computers, was to bounce it to audio and kind of repeat that process of EQ, distortion, EQ, distortion, EQ, distortion. Now the technology that's at our fingertips is so incredible that we don't have to do that necessarily. So I can probably just simply put on a few extra layers of processing and get to very further different sort of aspects. Let's take this this one that has the phase lock a little bit further. So the reason that you're hearing that sort of phasing sort of sound is because these oscillator phases are close to each other. If I were to switch them away, when they're completely out of phase from each other, and on 0 and 180 degrees, that actually kind of kicks it up that octave, as you can hear. Or if you're at 360. So what we literally are doing is affecting the phase of this synth. So sometimes what I really like to do is I like to put a phaser on this to further accentuate that. One of the phasers that I really like, and this is kind of crucial to my sound design, is Sugar Bytes Effectrix. It's a plugin that it became really popular, I think probably around 2010, with the whole Skrillex sort of modernization, or even Complextro, and kind of that whole modernization of electronic music. And a lot of people just use it as this sort of pattern programmer, but I like to just draw out a single thing on the phaser. And what I'll do is I'll turn it to some sort of rate, and that's actually why I like Effectrix's phaser so much, is because you can really lock in the rate into the grid, and I find that incredibly useful. So as I'm continuing further with this sort of sound design, I'm gonna pull down the stages gradually, and we'll see how that changes things. I'll mess with the rate here too to show you a little bit more of what that can do to affect it. So we'll do the same sort of practice again, pulling down these stages. My favorite is stage 2. I don't know why necessarily. Just going to be honest on that one. But that's what I've kind of found to be the most like grimy and sort of interesting for what I do with my bass sound design, is either 2 or 3 on Effectrix. I don't know again why, but again, if I pull Effectrix off and I go back to Serum and I were to mess around with the detuning, this is essentially doing the same thing, because the detuning from each other, what that's doing is it's setting the speed for which the oscillators kind of interact with each other and cross over each other whenever this phase randomization button is kind of disengaged. So if we mess with this, we can kind of get some unique sort of tone too. So again, Effectrix is turned off. We go here to this detune and just see how this affects it. Maybe introducing more voices into this equation would change it up like crazy too. So yeah, you can really get different variation in that sort of phased sound by dealing with the unison in terms of the number of voices and also how far detuned those voices are from each other. So we'll leave this here and we'll go back to this phaser. So again, just drastically changing that sound with the addition of another phaser. So I'll just rename this bass phase lock. Delete this guy because we're not using him anymore. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this channel over so that we have this new Effectrix. Pull this guy down, go into Serum, and let's turn off that phase lock and see how things sound on here. Crazy. Just a difference. So just knowing and understanding that subtle difference will unlock a totally different palette of sounds. And just kind of knowing and getting to know which sound is going to give you what is going to be a huge thing. So just to kind of close up this sort of segment on this, I'm going to go back to this phase locked one that I have, and I'm going to bring this completely to 1. just no detune on it whatsoever. It's just going to be straight up locked into itself. So now I'll just play this when it's brought down to one voice on each oscillator, and let's see how that sounds. So that's kind of how I've gotten a lot of my sort of electro sort of bass sound design, is because whenever you have it locked into itself and it's just down at 1 on the voices, that really brings out and accents the saw wave. Let's turn this up. Phase randomization. What's going to happen now is that this is going to gradually shift over the course of time. So I just bring that down and that locks it into itself. So we can pull all this stuff off and you can really hear. Kind of has that old school electro feel to it because it's just locked in. It's not going to change at all. Whereas if you have voices up, starts to spread away from itself, and even further whenever you have that phase randomization locked off. So yeah, that's the use of phase randomization and phase lock on an oscillator. It's one of those just things that has been hugely powerful to me and kind of understanding the foundation of sound design. So I'm going to transition now away from bass sort of stuff into chord design and how that button really affects that. So let's go ahead and turn this off for now. And I've got a little chord pattern already plotted out here. Let's listen to this. So with the phase randomization off, you can tell it's kind of engaging that phase sort of sound. Whereas whenever you pull that all the way out, that's how you get that super saw sound, because they're not locked in and they're not going to start at the same point every single time. They're kind of a little bit more free and a little bit more spacey as you pull these voices apart from each other. So the thing that I really like about this feature is that as you engage it, as you don't allow the oscillators to move from each other from their starting point, what you're able to do is kind of get more of a sampled sort of sound. And it almost sounds like, I mean, you literally are re-triggering that oscillator in the exact same point every single time. And it enables a very different sound. So you can take something that might sound like that sort of trancey super saw sound. So you could use that and write big room house, or you could even make trance or whatever, dubstep sort of stuff with it. But even if you were going to write a very different type of dubstep or even a different type of electro house, you could just completely turn that off, and then it totally changes the vibe and the feel of it right off the bat. So just understanding that and understanding that that's the basis of sound design, that's the most foundational thing, I think, even before you get into waveforms or even before you get into some of the depth that you can really go into sound design with. if you set that as your foundational point, you can really go so many different directions with that one sort of feature. So yeah, in recap, we just talked about a couple of ways that you can really use the tools that you're already using in a very different way and make your sound more unique to you. So if you have any more questions about anything that you just learned, feel free to get in touch with me via Fader Pro, and we'll see you next time.